The Champions Challenge. For many players, this place is simply a long stop on their way to the trimmed completionist cape. For most other players, this is a slog that's often ignored for its lack of rewards and tedious design. But for me, it's also unfinished content, filled with potential and waiting for that sense of finality. What's up, everyone? This is Destroyer229, and welcome to the Hotspot. On today's episode, we'll be focusing on the Champions Challenge D&D, and not only how we can expand upon its foundations, but also how we can fix some of the core problems relating to this piece of content. We'll be looking at this in 3 parts. First, we'll go over the history of this content, and see how we got to this point. Second, we'll go over the new additions I'll be proposing in order to fully complete this piece of content. And third, we'll go over some changes to the core of this update, including experience rates and adding in bad luck mitigation. So without further ado, let's begin with a history lesson. The Champions Challenge was first released on December 12, 2005. To start, you only needed to have access to the Champions Guild, and have been lucky enough to find a Champions Scroll, a rare 1 in 5,000 drop from one of 10 monsters across Gielinor. You would then take this scroll to Larxus, in the basement of the guild, to enter a fight with that creature's champion. These fights had various restrictions in place during the fight, such as style, weapon, or prayer restrictions. Upon beating the champion, you would be rewarded with a token amount of Constitution and Slayer experience, relative to that champion's strength. If you were lucky enough to get all 10 scrolls and beat all 10 lesser champions, then you would be able to fight Leon Decor, the human champion of champions. This would be it for the update for years, and was for all intents and purposes fully complete. But that would change on November 9th, 2009, when the Champions Challenge was updated. This introduced a beginner champion with the Leprechaun champion, introduced 3 new lesser champions, and a new champion of champions, Glofrin, champion of gnomes. The event would be updated on March 3rd, 2010 to be officially classified as a Distraction and Diversion, and various buffs were made on May 15th, 2015 to the various champions and made the event replayable. But let's go back to that major update in 2009. When the event was released, there were 6 figures that washed over the arena, the Champions of Champions. These were the aforementioned Leon and Glofrin, but also included a werewolf, a dwarf, an elf, and a Tsar champion. With the initial update, it could be assumed that a person could only fight the champion of champions of their own race, hence why we could only fight Leon. But with the update, we could fight a second champion of champions. So why can we not fight the other 4? What's stopping us from truly becoming a champion of champions? Well, obviously because there aren't any other scrolls to gain. I've always thought that it was weird that we could only ever fight 2 of these 6 figures, and this video is my proposal to fix this problem. My proposal would be to add all 4 of the other Champion of Champions, and expanding the number of lesser champions that would be available to us. Now, how many champions will we need? Well, I think the old update does a pretty good job at setting a precedent. To fight a Champion of Champions, you need to defeat 10 lesser champions. After which, for every 3 additional champions you defeat, you gain access to the next Champion of Champions. This would continue until one has beaten all 6 Champions of Champions. So that means that we would need 12 lesser champions added to the game, along with the big guys themselves. But then, how do we decide which monsters should have their own lesser champions? For my proposal, I looked into all of the available monsters that one can seal on the Slayer Codex. I then applied 4 rules to decide which monsters would be eligible to be part of this activity. The rules are as follows. 1. The creature must display some level of sentience. All of the champion scrolls are written by the lesser champions, and so the champions must have some cognitive level associated with them. Monsters like hellhounds or dinosaurs can't normally speak or write, and so they would not be eligible. 2. The creature must not be of the same or higher class as a greater champion. What is a class in this instance? It's more like, is this creature on the same level of importance as a champion of champions? A few examples would be that vampires would make no sense as a lesser champion, considering that a werewolf is a greater champion. Aviancy are also of a similar level as the other champions and should also not be considered. And dragons could also fall under this classification, so all dragons would not be considered. 3. The creatures must be found on Gielinor and must have been around since the 5th Age. This rule implies that these lesser champions have been around the entire time, and since the whole update could be considered as being available since the 5th Age, we need to limit ourselves with creatures that only came about prior to the 6th Age. So beings like automatons would not be considered, as they were only discovered literally right before Guthix was killed. Also, it makes no sense that creatures off Gielinor would be champions here, so beings like the crystalline shapeshifters or the arid don't count either. This also includes monsters where it doesn't make sense for them to be champions. This applies to monsters like the spiritual warriors, as it makes no narrative sense for them to leave God Wars Dungeon 1. The only exception would be creatures from Xanaris, as that's had a direct connection to the world well established prior to the world wakes. 4. The creature must have a Slayer level no higher than 85. This one's a little more arbitrary, but I just feel like anything more powerful than an Abyssal Demon wouldn't fit well into this kind of update. This rule didn't eliminate a creature that wasn't already eliminated in any of the prior rules, but it does give us a ceiling as to what level of monster we're looking at here. So with all the rules established, here are the monsters that are eligible to being lesser champions. In total, there are 24 monsters that qualify, which was a lot smaller of a pool than I first thought. Now, theoretically, one can take any combination of these 24 to make the 12 necessary champions. But for this video, our new lesser champions are the Ghost, which includes Revenants, the Moss Giant, the Troll, the Ogre, the Greater Demon, and all of its variants, the Shadow Warrior, the Shade, the Abyssal Demon, the Gargoyle, the Pyre Fiend, the Mutated Zygamite, and the Water Fiend. Now, as for their fights, there'd also need to be some restrictions that come with fighting each of these champions. We won't go into all potential restrictions here, as that's not necessary for our proposal, but some examples could include necromancy-related tasks. Yes, necromancy is not 5th Age, but it would explain why we couldn't fight some of these guys. Examples being only using necromancy damage or only using conjure damage. Non-necromancy restrictions could be using only poison damage or using only defensive abilities. These would also need to apply to the champion of champions, like say only using silver weapons on the werewolf champion, or perhaps putting in armor restrictions, like obsidian or crystal armor for the Tsar and Elf champions respectively, along with a few other restrictions that can be added to the champion of champions. It'd be interesting to see what you all can come up with and see how unique these fights can become. but no one will want to challenge these new champions if the rewards aren't worth it. So why don't we take a look at that next? The current Champions Challenge has two major problems stopping people from engaging with it. 1. The experience you get, honestly, sucks. 2. The scrolls are insanely hard to get a hold of. So we'll need to make some changes to entice people to engage with the updated Champions Challenge. First, let's talk rewards. I think buffing the base rewards of the old champions would be necessary in some way. Honestly, buffing the Champions XP by any amount would help, but it's important to keep in mind that this is a weekly repeatable event, and we'd be buffing the total number of fights from 15 to 31, so we need to take that into consideration when buffing XP rates. While I do think just simply buffing those XP rates for each individual fight is one viable solution, another solution that could tie to the D&D portion of this event would be a Battle Royale, available once you beat 5 lesser champions. Essentially, you'd have a wave-based fight with 5 lesser champions fighting you at once, with each of their restrictions in place against them. This may need to be tweaked for some champions where this wouldn't make much sense, like say with the Ghoul you can't use your inventory until it's defeated. But regardless, you'd have 5 random champions that you would have to take on. Once you defeat those 5, if you've defeated at least 10 total lesser champions, then another random 5 would come out that you would then fight. You could choose how many waves you want to fight by talking to Larxus prior to starting these fights, and you would only have 1 reward run per week. Successfully defeat the waves, and you get 2 lamps for each wave with progressively higher Slayer and Constitution experience. Die, and you lose your reward run and have to try again the next week. If you defeated all of the lesser champions, then the final wave would be all of the Champion of Champions fighting together, perhaps with some boss mechanics added to them to make the fight more challenging. The reward lamps would be scaled up based on the number of waves, so only taking on wave 1 would reward 10,000 Constitution and Slayer lamps. Beating 2 waves gives 20k lamps, and so on. Beating the final wave with the Champion of Champions results in a 100k experience lamp for both skills. Note that these lamps aren't cumulative. Beating the second wave doesn't result in a 10k and a 20k lamps, you'd only get the higher level lamp. And dying means you don't get any lamps, and you'd have to try again the following week, although you could take on the waves again as practice, similar to Morvrin's challenge. But that's just the rewards. There's still another aspect to the Champions Challenge that people despise, and that is the drop rate. Each scroll currently has a static 1 in 5,000 chance to drop, with the only way of improving that being the Champion Scroll Enhancer, which, according to the Runescape wiki, brings the drop rate to a massive 1 in 4,166. So yeah, not that much of a help. I've seen some people recommend that the scrolls just become guaranteed after a number of kills, like 5 or 10,000, but that kind of feels like spoiling the original spirit of the Champions Challenge. What I want to do is make tangible progress in making the drops more common without just giving the scrolls out after a certain number of kills. So here's my recommendation. All scrolls still have a base drop rate of 1 in 5,000. After killing 1,000 monsters of the same type, your drop rate will be lowered by 500, meaning that you would now have a 1 in 4,500 chance of receiving the scroll from that monster. This builds up until you hit a drop rate of 1 in 1,000, meaning at worst, you would need to kill 8,000 of that monster to get the lowest natural drop rate for that scroll. But that's not the only way that you can lower your drop rate. After each champion of champions is defeated, all remaining lesser scrolls have their drop rates lowered by 1 stage. So for example, everyone who's already defeated Glofrin would already have a 1 in 4,000 chance on all of the new lesser champions. Defeating the Werewolf champion would make all remaining scrolls at worst be 1 in 3,500, and so on. These two factors stack, so defeating 3 Champion of Champions and let's say 2,000 Shades would give a drop rate to the Shade Champion scroll at a 1 in 2,500. But what about the Enhancer? Well, the Enhancer, when used, will drop the drop rate of whatever monster you're killing by 1 stage. So for example, if your current drop rate with Moss Giants is 1 in 2,000, with the Enhancer, this would make the drop 1 in 1,500 for the Moss Giant scroll, using up 1 charge per kill as it currently does. But what if you already had a 1 in 1,000 drop rate? The Enhancer would still drop it by 1 stage, being the only way that you could have a 1 in 500 chance of a champion scroll. This still makes the Enhancer useful, and while it would technically be a nerf from what it currently does to a monster at the lowest odds, the Enhancers still maintain their usefulness throughout your journey, and isn't just some Hail Mary play to make the odds just slightly better in your favor. So that is this hotspot for the week. What do you think? Is there any part that you think could be tweaked? Do you have any ideas for potential restrictions on the champions? Or maybe you have a better balance for some of the XP rewards? I'd love to be able to hear what you all recommend down in the comments, and if we get enough engagement, I'd love to make a follow-up video on what you all recommend to improve the Champions Challenge. Thank you all for watching, and until next time everyone, take care.